Everyone thinks America is different from past empires. Spain thought that. Britain thought that. The Soviet Union thought that too. The problem isn't politics. It's math. And history shows what happens when the same conditions line up. It's happened 4 times across 6 centuries. And each time, the people living through it believed their situation was fundamentally different from what came before. They were wrong every single time. The pattern isn't obvious because it unfolds slowly at first. A decade or 2 of manageable problems, budget deficits that seem controllable, military costs that seem justified, currency weakness that seems temporary. Then something shifts. The problems stop being manageable. And what looked like a stable empire collapses faster than anyone thought possible. The Soviet Union went from superpower to non-existent in less than 1,000 days. Britain went from controlling a quarter of the earth to liquidating its empire in 25 years. Spain went from the richest throne in Europe to serial bankruptcy in 4 decades. Different centuries, different systems, identical mathematics, because that's what this is, mathematics. When certain structural conditions align, military overextension, currency debasement, debt accumulation, productive capacity loss, the outcome isn't random, it's predictable, not in timing, but in sequence. Let me show you what that sequence looks like, starting with the most recent case, the one where we have the clearest documentation, the one that proves the pattern isn't ancient history, it's modern reality. December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, not defeated in war, not overthrown by revolution, dissolved through internal economic contradictions that became mathematically terminal. 6 years earlier, in 1985, the USSR looked permanent. Nuclear superpower, global influence, military forces matching the United States, space program, satellite states spanning Eastern Europe. Anyone suggesting it would disappear by decade's end would have been dismissed as delusional. But the foundations were already crumbling, and the people running the system either couldn't see it or couldn't acknowledge it because acknowledgement would require changes that seemed politically impossible. The Soviet economy had stopped growing in the 1970s. Official statistics claimed otherwise, but Western economists examining physical data, energy consumption, freight transport, steel production, concluded that real output was stagnant or declining. The command economy couldn't process price signals. Central planning created systematic inefficiency. Factories met quotas by producing goods no one wanted. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was importing grain, despite having some of the world's most fertile agricultural land. This wasn't a temporary supply shock. This was systemic failure, an economy that couldn't feed itself. But the Soviet leadership couldn't reduce military spending because the military was the only thing holding the empire together. They were spending between 15 and 20% of GDP on defense, triple what America spent as a percentage of economy. They had to match American technology, American alliances, American reach, with an economy perhaps 1/3 the size. This is what I call the Imperial payroll trap. Once you've extended far enough that your commitments require unsustainable spending, you can't cut spending without triggering the collapse you're trying to prevent. The satellites leave, the client states defect, the military fractures, so you keep spending money you don't have until the system breaks. For the USSR, the break came through oil prices. In 1986, oil collapsed from roughly $30 per barrel to below $10. Soviet export revenues evaporated. They couldn't import Western technology, couldn't buy grain, couldn't service debts. The hard currency dried up. The ruble was never a real currency. It couldn't be freely exchanged internationally. Even Soviet citizens didn't trust it. They wanted dollars or Deutsche Marks. The government had to purchase foreign goods with gold and oil because no one wanted rubles. This is monetary system failure. By 1989, the Soviet Union couldn't afford to suppress independence movements in Eastern Europe. When Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia declared independence, Soviet troops stationed there weren't being paid regularly. Equipment wasn't maintained. Gorbachev's decision not to intervene wasn't idealism. It was recognition that intervention was fiscally impossible. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. 26 months later, the Soviet Union didn't exist. 900 days from losing the satellites to complete dissolution. No external invasion, pure economic implosion. Here's what matters about the Soviet case. The collapse was visible to outside observers years before it happened. Western intelligence agencies, academic economists, even some Soviet officials recognized the system was mathematically unsustainable. But the Soviet leadership couldn't make the changes necessary to prevent collapse because those changes, massive military cuts, economic liberalization, admitting systemic failure, would trigger the political crisis they were trying to avoid. So they continued existing policies until the system imploded. This is the recognition gap, the time between when experts see the problem and when it becomes politically possible to address it. And during that gap, the structural conditions worsen until collapse becomes inevitable. The Soviet Union is the clearest modern example. But it's not the first time this sequence played out. It's not even the second. Let me show you the longer historical case, the one that proves the pattern isn't specific to communism or command economies. It happens to capitalist democracies too. Britain in 1918 emerged victorious from the Great War. The British Empire covered 25% of the world's land surface, 412 million subjects. The pound sterling remained the global reserve currency. London was still the financial center of the world. British naval supremacy remained unquestioned. To observers in 1918, Britain looked secure, damaged by war, certainly, but still the dominant global power, still the empire on which the sun never set. The idea that within 30 years the empire would be liquidating and Britain would be dependent on American loans seemed absurd. But the war had broken something fundamental. Britain had borrowed enormous sums to finance the war effort, mostly from the United States. By 1918, Britain owed America more than they'd ever owed anyone in history. The world's creditor for a century had become a debtor. This was structural shift. The war also drained Britain's gold reserves. They'd shipped gold to America to pay for weapons, food, supplies. By 1920, British gold reserves were roughly half their 1914 levels, but Britain tried to maintain the pound's pre-war value anyway. In 1925, Winston Churchill, serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer, returned Britain to the gold standard at pre-war parity. This decision, which Churchill later called the greatest mistake of his life, overvalued the pound. British exports became too expensive. Manufacturing couldn't compete. Unemployment surged. The government maintained high interest rates to defend the currency, strangling domestic growth. For 6 years, Britain sacrificed industrial capacity to maintain currency prestige. By 1931, the policy was unsustainable. Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound lost approximately 25% of its value overnight. Foreign holders of sterling reserves saw their assets decline instantly. The global reserve currency had just admitted it couldn't keep its promises. This is what I call the reserve currency boomerang. When you're the reserve currency, the world needs to hold your money. So you can run deficits. You can import more than you export. You can live beyond your means, because everyone needs your currency for trade and reserves. But that privilege creates a trap. Your economy hollows out because imports are cheaper than domestic production. Your manufacturing base erodes. Your productive capacity shrinks. And you become dependent on the world continuing to need your currency. The moment they don't need it anymore, all those currencies you exported come flooding back. Prices explode. The advantage becomes a catastrophic vulnerability. Britain never escaped World War I debt before World War II started. The Second War cost another $120 billion in 1945 money. By war's end, Britain owed the United States and Canada approximately $30 billion, more than British GDP. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 kept Britain functioning. The United States lent $3.75 billion at 2% interest, but the conditions included making sterling convertible and opening British markets. This effectively dismantled the trade preferences holding the empire together economically. Britain couldn't afford to hold the empire anymore. In 1947, they granted independence to India and Pakistan. Not generosity, fiscal necessity. Each colony required military forces Britain couldn't fund. Over the next 25 years, the empire dissolved. Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, all gone. The pound's value declined steadily. Pre-war parity was around $4.86. After 1949 devaluation, $2.80. After 1967 devaluation, $2.40. By the 1980s, around $2. The global reserve currency became a regional currency. Britain maintained symbolic prestige, UN Security Council seat, nuclear weapons, special relationship with America. But everyone understood the reality. Britain was now a middle power dependent on American security guarantees. The empire was gone, permanently. From 1918 to 1970, 52 years from victory in World War I to complete liquidation of empire. That's one generation, one lifetime. The pattern played out more slowly than the Soviet collapse, but it played out just as completely. Now let's go back further. To the original case, the first global empire, the one that established the template every subsequent empire would follow. Spain in the mid-1500s controlled something unprecedented in human history. They'd conquered the Aztec and Inca civilizations, seized the silver mines at Potosi and modern-day Bolivia. These mines produced more precious metal than the rest of the world combined. By 1550, Spanish galleons were carrying 200 tons of silver annually from the Americas to Europe. By 1600, over 400 tons. This wasn't just wealth. This was control over the global money supply. Because silver was money, and Spain controlled silver, the Spanish real was accepted from Manila to Amsterdam. Everyone wanted Spanish silver. King Philip II, ruling from 1556 to 1598, inherited the richest throne in human history. He used that wealth to fight wars on a scale never before attempted, against the Ottoman Empire across the Mediterranean, against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands for 80 years, against England's navy in the Atlantic, against France and Italy, colonial wars in the Philippines. By 1580, Spanish forces were deployed on 4 continents. The cost was extraordinary. Philip spent approximately half of crown revenue on military expenses, and it wasn't enough. Wars cost more than expected. Campaigns lasted longer than planned. Soldiers who weren't paid mutinied. And Spanish mutinies were devastating. Here's where Spain made the fatal choice. Instead of reducing commitments to match resources, they manipulated the currency. Spanish mints began mixing copper into silver coins. A real that was supposed to contain specific silver content was increasingly diluted. By 1599, coins were 50% copper. By 1603, 75% copper. The face value stayed the same, but actual metal content plummeted. This is debasement, creating more nominal money without increasing. Real value. Prices rose faster in Spain than anywhere else in Europe. Merchants began testing coins, rejecting debased ones, or demanding more coins for the same goods. But Spain couldn't stop debasing because they couldn't afford their commitments. So they borrowed. From Italian banking houses, from German merchant families, at increasingly punitive interest rates because everyone knew Spain's record. Spain declared bankruptcy in 1557, defaulted on debts, restructured, promised reforms, then borrowed more at higher rates. They declared bankruptcy again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596. 7 bankruptcies total between 1557 and 1647. Each time, creditors took losses. Each time, Spain's borrowing costs increased. By the 1590s, Spain was borrowing to pay interest on existing debt. New loans didn't fund wars or infrastructure. They funded debt service. Ponzi, mathematics. Mathematically terminal. But here's what actually destroyed Spain. The unlimited silver created a perverse incentive. Why grow food when you can import it from Sicily? Why build ships when you can buy them from Holland? Why manufacture textiles when French and Italian goods are available? Spanish nobility considered work beneath them. Spanish agriculture declined. Spanish manufacturing collapsed. By 1600, Spain imported nearly everything. The silver flowed in from Potosi and immediately flowed out to pay for imports. Spain became a pass-through. And when the silver mines peaked in the 1590s and production started declining, the entire model collapsed. No domestic production meant total import dependence. Declining silver meant inability to pay. Economic implosion followed. By 1640, Spain lost Portugal in rebellion. By 1700, the Spanish Empire was hollow, still large on maps, economically dead. Spain never recovered. Today, it's a pleasant, mid-sized European nation with almost no global influence. The pattern ran from dominance to irrelevance in roughly 80 years. 3 empires, 3 collapses, different centuries, different systems, different ideologies. But if you look closely at what actually happened, beneath the surface details, the structural sequence is identical. And that sequence can be broken into 7 specific stages, not arbitrary categories. Mathematical thresholds that, once crossed, make the next stage increasingly difficult to avoid. Let me show you what those stages actually are. Stage 1 is military overextension relative to economic capacity. Not just having a large military. Every great power has that. This is when your military commitments exceed what your economy can sustainably support. When you're defending territory or allies in so many locations that the costs consume resources needed for productive investment. Spain fought on 4 continents simultaneously while domestic infrastructure crumbled. Britain defended 6 continents while British industry fell behind Germany and America. The USSR matched American military reach with an economy 1/3 the size. Stage 2 is monetary dysfunction, either through direct debasement like Spain, mixing copper into silver, or through loss of convertibility like Britain abandoning gold, or through printing without backing like the USSR's ruble. The mechanism varies. The effect is consistent. The currency loses credibility, inflation rises, real purchasing power declines. Stage 3 is the debt trap. When interest payments consume an increasing share of revenue, when new borrowing funds, old debt service rather than productive investment, Spain declared 7 bankruptcies. Britain borrowed from America to stay afloat. The USSR ran out of hard currency as oil prices collapsed. Once you're in the trap, escape requires either default or austerity so severe it triggers the political crisis you're trying to prevent. Stage 4 is productive hollowing. The domestic economy stops producing what it consumes. Manufacturing declines, agriculture fails, innovation stagnates. The country becomes dependent on imports. Spain produced almost nothing by 1600. Britain's industrial base eroded from the 1920s through the 1960s. The USSR couldn't feed itself despite having vast agricultural resources. This happens because maintaining empire and maintaining productive capacity are in tension. Empire requires military spending, which diverts resources from investment. Reserve currency status makes imports cheaper than domestic production, which destroys industries. The short-term benefits of imperial control undermine long-term economic sustainability. Stage 5 is social decay. Trust in institutions collapses. Crime rises. Emigration of talent accelerates. Fertility declines. Political dysfunction prevents necessary reforms. Spain's productive class fled to France and the Netherlands. Britain experienced class conflict and imperial exhaustion. The USSR faced ethnic tensions and ideological disillusionment. Stage 6 is loss of privileged economic status. For reserve currencies, this means foreign central banks and traders stop holding your money. For empires, this means satellites and colonies leave. The mechanisms that made you powerful, everyone needing your currency, everyone accepting your military dominance, reverse. Britain lost empire and reserve status simultaneously between 1947 and 1970. The USSR lost its satellites in 1989. Stage 7 is systemic collapse or forced restructuring. The Soviet Union dissolved. Britain liquidated empire and accepted middle power status. Spain fractured with Portugal leaving and the Netherlands gaining independence. The structure that existed before cannot continue. What emerges afterward is always smaller, weaker, and less influential than what came before. Now, here's what makes this pattern so dangerous. It's not that leaders don't see it. Intelligence services, academic economists, outside observers often recognize the trajectory years before collapse. The Soviet Union's terminal economic problems were widely documented by the mid-1980s. Britain's unsustainable imperial costs were obvious by the 1930s. Spain's fiscal crisis was apparent by the 1570s. The problem is that stopping the pattern requires actions that seem politically impossible. Cutting military commitments triggers the collapse you're trying to prevent. Acknowledging currency weakness triggers capital flight. Defaulting on debt destroys your credibility. Admitting your productive capacity has eroded requires accepting lower living standards. So leaders continue existing policies. They believe they can manage the decline, navigate the contradictions, find some solution that avoids the hard choices. And during that period of managed decline, the structural problems worsen, the debt grows, the productive capacity shrinks further, the social decay accelerates, until the system hits a threshold where managed decline becomes uncontrolled collapse. This is why intelligent, informed leaders fail to stop the pattern, not because they're stupid, because the actions required to interrupt the sequence are so politically costly that they guarantee the leader's removal from power, and their replacement will face the same incentives. So the pattern continues until mathematics forces the resolution. With that framework established, we can now examine where the United States currently sits, not through narrative storytelling like the historical cases, through analytical assessment of which stages America has entered. The United States maintains over 750 military installations across approximately 80 countries. American forces deploy to over 150 nations. Commitments include defending NATO's 31 members, defending Japan and South Korea in Asia, defending Israel and other partners in the Middle East, and countering Chinese expansion in the Pacific. Annual defense spending exceeds $850 billion, roughly 3.5% of GDP. That's lower than the Soviet Union's 15 to 20%. But American commitments are global in a way even the USSR's weren't. And military leaders consistently testify that current spending is insufficient for all stated commitments. If multiple crises occurred simultaneously, China invading Taiwan, Russia escalating in Ukraine, Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, the United States military cannot respond at full capacity to all of them. This is structural overextension. Stage 1 is present. Since 1971, the dollar has been pure fiat currency. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from roughly $800 billion in 2008 to over $8 trillion by 2025. The money supply increased substantially, particularly during the 2020-2021. Over $5 trillion was created in response to COVID-19. The dollar hasn't collapsed. Inflation from 2021 to 2023 reached levels not seen since the early 1980s, but stabilized by 2024. The currency still functions. But the trajectory is clear. More currency units chasing similar quantities of goods, declining real purchasing power over time. Stage 2 is present in early form. Federal debt exceeds $36 trillion, approximately 120% of GDP. Annual interest payments are approaching $1 trillion. The United States spends more servicing debt than on defense. Annual deficits exceed $1.5 trillion despite economic expansion. The Congressional Budget Office projects interest payments exceeding $2 trillion annually by the mid-2030s. Before Social Security, before Medicare, before defense, just interest on existing debt. And those projections assume no major economic shocks, no wars, no crises that require additional borrowing. This is the debt trap. New borrowing increasingly funds debt service rather than productive investment. Stage 3 is clearly present. American manufacturing as a percentage of GDP declined from approximately 28% in 1953 to roughly 11% by 2025. The United States closed over 65,000 factories between 2000 and 2020. Entire industries have been offshored. The United States runs persistent trade deficits, around $800 billion annually. America imports far more than it exports. The country is dependent on foreign supply chains for pharmaceuticals, electronics, rare earth elements, and components for military systems. This works because the dollar remains the global reserve currency. The world needs dollars for trade, so they accept American currency in exchange for real goods. This is productive hollowing enabled by reserve currency status. Stage 4 is present. Trust in major institutions has declined substantially. Congressional approval ratings hover around 15 to 20%. Trust in media is approximately 30%, according to Gallup. Roughly half the country questions the integrity of recent elections. Drug overdose deaths exceed 100,000 annually. Homelessness has surged in major cities. Fertility rates have fallen to 1.6 children per woman below replacement level. Political dysfunction prevents major legislation. Infrastructure projects take decades and cost multiples of initial projections. These are indicators of social decay, not terminal, not irreversible, but present and intensifying. Stage 5 is developing. Stage 6 is loss of reserve currency status. This is where America's situation differs most significantly from the historical cases, because the dollar's reserve status remains intact. But the early indicators of erosion are visible. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from around 70% in the late 1990s to approximately 58% by late 2024, according to IMF data. That's a 12 percentage point drop over roughly 25 years. Central banks globally are purchasing gold at rates not seen since the 1970s. China and Russia conduct bilateral trade in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia has begun accepting yuan for some oil sales to China. The BRICS nations are developing alternative payment systems. These are hedging behaviors, preparations for a world where dollar dependence is reduced. Stage 6 hasn't fully arrived. The dollar remains dominant. But the early phase is underway. And history suggests that once reserve currency erosion begins, it tends to accelerate rather than reverse. Here's why the historical pattern matters for understanding America's current position. The United States has entered 5 of 7 stages. The Soviet Union reached stage 5 before total collapse in 900 days. Britain reached stage 5 by the 1930s and liquidated empire by 1970. Spain reached stage 5 by the 1580s and became irrelevant by 1650. The timing varies. The specific mechanisms vary, but the sequence is consistent. And each historical case shows that once you're past stage 4, once productive capacity is eroded and the economy is hollowed out, reversing course becomes exponentially harder. Because at that point, you're dependent on your privileged status, the reserve currency, the imperial position, the ability to import more than you produce. And maintaining that status requires projecting strength you can no longer afford. So you print money to fund the military that defends the system that allows you to print money. It's circular. And it works until confidence breaks. The pattern also shows acceleration. Spain took roughly 80 years from peak to collapse. Britain took about 50 years. The USSR took 6 years from Afghanistan. Withdrawal to dissolution. Each subsequent case moved faster because global capital flows increased. Information spread faster and alternative powers could rise more quickly. If America follows the pattern, and there's no guarantee it will. But historical precedent suggests vulnerability. The timeline from entering stage 5 to reaching stage 7 could be measured in decades rather than centuries. Not immediate, not tomorrow, but not some distant future either. The question isn't whether the pattern exists. History proves it does. The question is whether American policymakers can recognize the trajectory early enough to make changes that interrupt the sequence. And that requires political will that no previous empire demonstrated. Because the changes necessary, substantial military retrenchment, fiscal austerity to reduce debt, industrial policy to rebuild manufacturing, institutional reforms to restore trust, are politically painful. They guarantee the leader who implements them will be removed from power, and their replacement will face the same incentives. So the pattern continues, the stages progress, and the mathematical inevitability that destroyed 3 previous empires moves closer to claiming a 4th. History doesn't repeat, but it does establish precedent. And when you see the same structural conditions emerging, overextension, monetary stress, debt accumulation, productive erosion, social decay, the burden of proof shifts. You have to explain why this time will be different, why America will escape a pattern that Spain, Britain, and the USSR could not. Maybe American institutions are more resilient. Maybe American innovation can offset industrial decline. Maybe the dollar's network effects are strong enough to maintain dominance indefinitely. Maybe political dysfunction will give way to necessary reforms. Or maybe the pattern plays out again, for the fourth time, with the same 7 stages, the same mathematical progression, the same outcome. The data is available, the historical precedent is clear, the structural conditions are present. What happens next depends on whether America recognizes the trajectory and makes changes no previous empire managed, or whether we continue existing policies and learn the same lessons Spain, Britain, and the USSR learned, that empires don't last forever, that dominant positions erode, that the mathematics of overextension, debt, and productive decline are stronger than any claim to exceptionalism, and that the pattern, once established, is very difficult to escape. If this framework showed you something you hadn't seen before, this channel tracks exactly these kinds of structural patterns across history and economics, because understanding what's actually happening matters more than what anyone promises is happening. And the distance between those two things is where the future reveals itself.